Dr. Susie Bennett. I mean, you started off in my life as a little Reddit handle, sending me a DM asking for help.
Yeah.
And now it's amazing how far you've come in just a few years.
Well, George, you've been instrumental. I mean, not just to my work, but to the movement in general. I think we all owe you a huge debt. I know we hate compliments back and forth, but like I salute you for all that you do, George, sincerely.
I live on the world of social media, which of course is not a true reflection of real life.
Yeah.
But it's impossible to ignore just the amount of hostility there is. Even within the context of when we're trying to discuss male suicide. I mean, I'm looking at a post right now. This is a recent report by Beyond Equality. Opening statement, 1 in 4 men believe no one will ever fall in love with them.
Mm-hmm.
Which obviously, you've got to be a pretty horrendous person not to
be moved by that.
To be moved by that. And I'm just going to read some of the comments out to you.
Yeah.
These are the most popular comments as well. Number 1, have they tried smiling more? 900 likes. And they're right. As in, they're right not to think anyone's going to love them. 200 likes. Nobody cares. 200 likes. Have they considered being lovable? 600 likes. Nothing wrong with self-awareness. 4,500 likes. We can get that rate up. 1,000 likes.
Wow.
If men suffer in silence, and why do I keep hearing about it? 500 likes. Well, that's on them, low key. Have men tried not being awful people so others might love them? 2,200 likes. And it's like, I would dream about getting that many likes on one of my posts in terms of a comment. And this is a post about how 1 in 4 men don't believe anyone could ever love them. And they're the comments we're receiving. And it's not just the headlines that are shocking, but it's the fact that people still hate conversation around it. I mean, you talked about how you went to a museum in London and you found that card that said, I like everybody.
Even men.
It's like double whammy of suicide is the greatest risk to my life. And then anyone that tries to research it is so often confronted with this barrage of angry responses and comments that just sneer and make the whole conversation so much more difficult. I
mean, it's horrendous. I mean, those comments are horrendous. I don't personally experience that through my work. I don't get that kind of feedback, but it's so difficult to be. It's painful because I've been brought into a different sense of men's reality. You
would never see that with another group. Like other groups that are at risk to certain things, you would hope to see people showing compassion towards that group for that issue. And you would never expect to see that.
There's this dehumanization. We've arrived in such a fundamentally unhealthy energy between men and women that's so bizarre in context to our sort of evolutionary history where our survival was absolutely bound together. Our survival continues, in my view, to be bound together. And yet we're culturally so often set in opposition to one another. And I know it's so easy to fall into that category. Like I've definitely brought my mum before fridge magnets that said disparaging things about men, and she's got 3 sons and I've got 3 brothers. Prior to doing this work, you know, it's so easy to think that you're just kind of having like this inside joke, but implicit in that is a real violence, particularly for men who, you know, in that, what that research represents, 1 in 4 men saying that they feel that they're never going to be loved in their lifetimes. Like that is such a harrowing view of your future self to be carrying around with you. And I think that not to be able to be present to the humanity in that statement, this is what I mean about the dehumanization, to immediately move into dismissing it, minimizing it, making jokes about it. I know that so often that comes from a place of trauma for people, but it's not taking us forward anywhere productive. That report that you're talking about, they also found that 45% of the men had thought about self-harm or suicide in the last 2 weeks. 45%.
Yeah.
If I was an alien visiting the UK and I was saying to you, tell me about life here, and you said there's this recent survey, 45% of the men that took part have thought about self-harm or ending their lives in the last 2 weeks, I would think, what is going on here? This place is sick. You know, this place is not well. It's not safe for people. And I think, you know, I get so, it's frustrating because to be generous, it's unhelpful. But I come from a perspective where I see how dangerous it is as well. I'm talking to men all the time who have this experience of the world of being deeply isolated and, you know, struggling to have their pain heard, understood, compassionately received. Comments like that are reinforcing that.
He's got to think about being a man that sees that 1 in 4 men feel like they'll never be loved. And then maybe the man reading is one of those 1 in 4. And they would hope to scroll down to see comments of, no, every man is deserving of love. And they only ever get more proof of the same. Like people saying, let's get that number up, or you don't deserve to be loved, or these men are just self-aware. And then not only that, but thousands of people liking that comment.
Yeah, and reinforcing. You know, I think it's so easy that we fall into this trap, and certainly I've been guilty of that in the past, and I think I've said this to you before, of when we look at men, we pick up a telescope and put on the front of it the lens of the worst men that we know, or the worst men that we hear about. It's so transformative, or it has been for me, when I pick up that telescope and I put on the lens of the best men that I've known. I wouldn't be sat here talking to you now without certain men in my life. I've known awful men, but I wouldn't be sat here now in the sort of as relatively functioning as, you know, I wouldn't be able without the love and support and care that I've received from, you know, from certain men. And those men all have struggles. And I think that there was a period of real shame for me in doing this work, where I started to realize how much my lens had become skewed and how much I was rendering invisible the pain of all the, you know, George, all the time in my work, I meet so many great, tender, kind, struggling men. I was thinking the other day, almost every message or email that I receive from a man includes the line, "How can I help?" There's such an energy of wanting for things to be different, not necessarily that they feel that it can be different for themselves, but wanting it to be different for other people. This is such a precious energy, George, in a world of like that's on fire with so many challenges. This spirit of wanting to help, wanting to positively contribute to things being different is so precious. I hear all the time, I'm in rooms and I'm in spaces where I hear things that, in the same way, if I was in a room and someone was being really homophobic or really racist, I don't want to be in that space. Cross-allyship for me is so important. I feel that as a queer person, when I hear straight people defending gay rights, there's for me something that feels so moving about it. And I think that I understand for some men that would look at me as a woman researching male suicide that would feel really uncomfortable about it. And I totally respect that. And I hope that if they engage with my work, they would feel less uncomfortable about it. But I do think that there's a place and a contribution that you can make as a woman studying this issue and going out and speaking to people in the same way. If you think of like what Ian Wright, for example, has done for women's football, for me is incredible. George, it's so moving to listen to. And this is what we need between each other, is that deep, deep listening. I need to understand what your experience is like as a man in the world, in the same way that I need you to understand, you know, what my experience is, so that we can collectively move forward. I want the world to be better for you, and I want you to want the world to be better for me too. And we're only going to get there if we have those exchanges of deep listening, of understanding, you know, what is going on for the other. It can be so hard when there's resistance to understanding what that experience is like for men. You see it then in those comments. Again, that is fucking horrendous. That is absolutely horrendous. What is going wrong for that to be manifesting?
Well, I'm glad you obviously brought up you are a woman studying male suicide, but it's important to tell people that your work is based on the testimony of suicidal men, bereaved families, thousands of them. It's not like you're just making this up. You're a quality researcher and you're always asking for men's experiences to base your research upon. So what do you find when you actually talk to these suicidal men? What are they telling you about themselves and what they've gone through?
That's really important to state, but that you cannot understand an experience as complicated as suicide without talking directly to the people that are living that reality, to understand from their perspectives what is going on for them. And that's been a strange thing historically in suicide research, that hasn't always been the heartbeat of the work, which I find absolutely kind of perplexing. First of all, suicide is incredibly complicated behavior. Like, thinking about a behavior like suicide, so many different factors can contribute to the drive towards that kind of behavior. And then, so not only is suicide incredibly complicated, I don't need to tell you this, but it's important to state, men are unbelievably diverse. Men are the full colours of the human spectrum. I speak to some men that still hold this belief that getting help or talking about your feelings is a weakness, and other men that they're desperate for help. They're desperate to talk about their problems, but they can't afford to access the help. Other men that maybe thought about a suicide attempt. There was a few minutes that passed between thinking about suicide and making an attempt. Other men that have been planning an attempt for many years. And, suicide can happen to people in insecure housing, to incredibly wealthy men, people that are married, single, so on. There's huge diversity. So for me, my experience of as a suicide researcher is kind of walking this tightrope between sort of respecting and acknowledging the individual complexity of each person's suicidal distress, and at the same time trying to establish some degree of commonality so that we can start to increase our understanding of what might be going on. Within all of that complexity, within all of that diversity, if I was kind of to distill suicide into its simplest form, for me it's just somebody who's experiencing intolerable levels of pain that they don't know how to regulate. And in that sort of unbearable state of pain, it can start to feel like suicide might be the only way to relieve or to resolve that pain. So then for me, three things become critical about understanding suicide. And I think we've said this before, but to imagine that each of us has this tank of pain. You've got a tank of pain, George. I've got a tank of pain. Jack's got a tank of pain. Every single person watching this is carrying their own tank of pain. I don't know what's in your tank, and it's unique to you and the lived experiences that you've had and your unique biology and the things that have happened to you. So if you imagine that you've got this, each of us has got this exposure pipe at the top of our tank that is uniquely pouring pain into our tank, that could be both about what's happening for us currently, so things to do with our relationships or work, but also things historically, things that have happened in our past, in our childhood, at school, can be pouring pain into our tank. And then if we imagine this pipe at the bottom, which is our regulation pipe, which when it works well should be helping us to take pain out of the tank. And there are good ways to regulate pain, and there are ways that maybe provide short-term relief, but in the long term can kind of expose us to more harm, which is something that we see often in things like using a drink, drugs, self-harm, gambling, food, sex to kind of get porn, short-term pain relief, but ultimately can be just exposing you to more pain. And I think anybody given high exposure to pain and poor regulation can reach a threshold where the pain is just building and building, and it hits a level where it feels intolerable. And in that moment of it feeling intolerable is when a sort of active suicidal crisis might emerge. So I kind of often have three questions in mind talking to a man, which is first of all to try and understand what his exposure to pain has been, both historically and currently. Second of all, what tools is he using to regulate that pain? And are they helping in the long run or not? And then third of all, what are the signs for that man when they're hitting their threshold, when that pain is becoming kind of intolerable? There's a great suicide researcher called Edwin Schneidman who said that the author of suicide is pain. The author of suicide is pain. I found that a really transformative quote, and I find that language of pain really resonant with men in particular. Some men find the language and framework of mental illness, mental health very helpful for helping make sense of what's going on for them. Other men really don't. But what I found in almost every conversation I've ever had with a man is that they will talk to me about their pain.
Pain's quite an abstract concept, though, isn't it? I mean, what are the things that are typically causing men this pain that you talk about? What are some of the associated factors that are pouring pain into that tank you mentioned?
That's absolutely the next question to ask. If we accept that pain is the author of suicide, the next logical question is, well, what's driving that pain?
I know, just an example, what research always shocks me is how much of an increase in suicidality someone who's experienced sexual abuse is. I think it's something like 3.5% of people will consider suicide in their life. However, if that boy, in this case, has experienced sexual abuse in adolescence, that goes up to 33%. So 10 times higher levels of suicidality in someone that's experienced sexual abuse in adolescence. And that is obviously just one of many things that push everyone, but obviously including men, towards suicide. I'm interested in what are the things that happen to men that shouldn't have happened, that push them towards having this tank of pain in their head that's just too full. Have men shared their experiences of such things with you, and do they sort of correlate with one another in terms of what are the shared experiences of men that push them towards suicide?
What I'm interested in is the psychological processes underneath those risk factors. So we know that there's a whole spectrum of different risk factors that can elevate your chances of being suicidal, like all kinds of childhood adversity, such as being bullied, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, relationship breakdown, being unemployed, having low income. All these different factors can increase your risk. The problem is those single risk factors in isolation, what can we do with them? Millions of people are unemployed, but not all of them will go on to kill themselves. So we kind of have to get underneath what's deeper underneath psychologically that's happening for people. That is kind of the bit that my kind of work focuses on. So how all these threads of risk factors, I talk about it as this like chord of pain. Every suicide is this individual symphony of sorrow. So you have an individual orchestra of pain. So do I. And when I feel suicidal, my symphony is not going to be like the same sounds as somebody else's. But I think within those individual symphonies, and as someone that's listened to a lot of them now, you start to hear this kind of common chord of pain, which is about these unmet needs, I think, in these three psychological areas, which we've spoken about before, these unmet social needs, unmet self needs, and unmet emotional needs. And different risk factors for different reasons can elevate pain in those three notes, in that three chord of pain.
So I suppose to wrap it up, to summarize, male suicide in its simplest form is the combination of someone that's under huge amounts of pain from various different orchestral causes. And then on top of that, it's the inability to regulate that pain. So you've got the pain coming into the tank and then the inability to let that out fast enough. And then all of that's wrapped around a set of coping mechanisms that often make the pain worse. So you mentioned like gambling, drinking, porn, sex, food, all these things that might short-term help someone feel better. But ultimately, if you go and gamble your savings away, you're only going to exacerbate the pain. What you think is helping is actually making it worse.
In terms of the regulation as well, or the tools that a person uses to regulate themselves, sometimes those certain tools can be helpful in an unsafe environment. So if I'm a 10-year-old boy who's going home every day to a parent that's telling me I'm a piece of shit, it can be a coping strategy to start telling myself that. Because then in a way, potentially it makes it less painful then. If I'm starting to believe that about myself, it's potentially less painful when I hear that from my caregiver. And so that may become, in that particular environment, the best coping strategy that you have without more significant kind of interventions. Then when you leave that environment and you become an adult, if you don't update that kind of regulation strategy, if you're still moving through jobs, relationships, friendships with that regulation tool, telling yourself that you're a piece of shit, then ultimately in the long run, it's going to be very difficult to meet your self needs in terms of establishing a kind of tolerable view of yourself if that's, become your ingrained coping strategy. But at the same time, I have a huge amount of respect and compassion for how different people's coping strategies can kind of evolve. There's this gorgeous guy called Paul who works for Men's Craft. He gave a talk at one of the knowledge sharing events we did this year, and he said something like, I drank to cope with the emotions that I didn't know how to feel. For me, it's just such a moving, powerful expression of needing to find a way to cope.
I want to come back to that because you talk a lot about the wisdom of suicidal men and how often the most emotionally literate people you've ever met have been men who are dealing with suicide, which again goes it's antithetical to what we're told about suicidal men, that they're emotionally stunted. And I agree with you, some of the most richest, most interesting, heartbreaking conversations I've ever had have been of men who are suicidal.
Yeah.
And they're sort of the pioneers of mental health in many ways. But I'll come back to that. But I just wanted to add to what you talked about in terms of coping mechanisms. One of the pieces of research that really changed my understanding of coping mechanisms was looking at bullying, which you mentioned. And it found there's a huge correlation between boys and girls, but especially boys who are severely bullied in school. And then when they grow up to have fantasies of violence.
Okay.
I think it was 97% of the most bullied boys in school went on to have violent fantasies. More or less all of the boys. The researcher who did that, he too found it was a coping mechanism where these boys were fantasizing about violence because that's what they were expecting. They were trying to deal with more violence, basically marinated in violence every single day of their life. So naturally they're going to fantasize about it as a way of dealing with it. And then they obviously never outgrew it, or they never found more healthy coping mechanisms. And then they arrive at this final point of a man who's got violent fantasies. And then instead of trying to understand what shapes that man's violent fantasies, we only ever, scold and shame them more as that man's dangerous, that man's toxic, that man's violent. But when in fact he's not. He's just a bullied boy that's now grown up. And it brings us back to the starting point we started at, where we seem to think men are static objects, that they don't have behind them a whole past history of often traumatic experiences that shape the behaviours that we often don't like. I'd hope that'd be the theme of the podcast, where we need to see men as the product of their own journey, just like anyone else. And maybe that's having fantasies of violence, maybe that's something else, but ultimately we become who we are by the journey we go on. One of the things that I found really interesting about your work is that suicide is not a modern phenomenon, sadly. Although obviously we're talking about it a lot more, and arguably it's worse than it's been in a long time. But you posted a lot about a historic story of suicide, I think thousands of years ago, a story of a man and his bar.
They think it's one of the sort of first sort of suicide notes, and it was written by a man 4,000 years ago in ancient Egypt, and it's a discussion between him and his soul. It's so moving when you read the poem. I really encourage people to try and find it online. And there's sort of like two motifs that he repeats in the poem, which I see echoed in the conversations that I have with men now in the modern world. And the first theme is around, he sort of repeats this line over and over: "Look, my name is reeking. Look, my name is reeking. My name is reeking." This sense of like shame about who he is, or this loss of social value, worthlessness, which again, when I talk about this core to pain, these self-needs, the needs that we have to tolerate ourselves. And if we can't tolerate ourselves, if we feel that we are some reeking entity in the world, it's a very painful state to live in. And all sorts of different factors can contribute to somebody feeling that sense of reeking.
But doesn't he also speak in the poem about the breakdown of his marriage, the loss of his home?
That's been speculated on as to his circumstances. And that may be the context that he feels his name is reeking because the marriage has broken down. And the other thing that he talks about, and the other sort of motif that comes up over and over again, is he asks, "To whom can I speak to today?" To whom can I speak to? And it talks a lot about hearts becoming greedy, that kindness has perished, that there's no brother's heart that you can depend on. And I hear in that these echoes of these unmet social needs, this need for belonging, for connection, for kindness, for intimacy, and the pain that he's carrying as a consequence of not being able to access those things. So for me, I'm very interested, George, in the things that hurt us 3,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, 300,000 years ago. What are those common chords of like human needs, human distress? For me, that's those are almost in like the first principles of human psychology, in a way, that we have to make sure as a society that we are meeting. And I think when you look around, we're just going back to that report of 45% of men in that survey had thought about self-harm or suicide in the last 2 weeks. We're clearly not meeting them, and we have collective responsibility to bear around that.
The right word is collective responsibility. And like my great challenge of helping people understand suicide is encouraging them to not see suicide as something a man is entirely in control of, and he can't solve the problem himself. Like people seem to think if a man talked or cried more, then that would solve the problem. But often it doesn't. Like going back to your tank, you have the pipe of pain and then the ability to regulate or inability to regulate it. Like at best, the man has got his hand on one of those taps, the ability to regulate, but he's not necessarily in control of the pain he's put under. That's often down to society. You mentioned like relationship breakdown is obviously a really important associated factor of suicide. And I really want to encourage people to not see suicide as something that lives inside of a man's head, but something that lives outside in society that places pressure onto so many men in many different ways that it's impossible to even name.
George, absolutely. I've never had a conversation with a man that's suicidal who's told me about his life, and I've not been, when placed in the context of all the pressures that he's carrying and the deep isolation he might feel and the way that he may have been starved of access to expressing the pain of that, is completely understandable. I'm somebody that's had thoughts and feelings of suicide since I was 18. Up until my last sort of serious, intense kind of fog of those feelings was August this year. So for me, it's like another tightrope of this research that we walk. For me, it's a completely normal response to have at times. You know, life can be incredibly difficult and challenging, and the modern world, I don't think in many ways is set up to meet many of our fundamental psychological needs. So it's a really normal response to have. At the same time, it's a response that you've got to take incredibly seriously, because it can be overwhelming and really dangerous and ultimately move you in a direction that you don't necessarily want to travel down. So in some ways, I want to take the fear out of suicide for people to understand that it's just, for many of us, a normal response to incredibly complicated things. It's very difficult sometimes when people want quick answers about suicide. And I think that if you want to make a difference about this issue, you're going to have to deeply engage with it. There's no one size fits all reality to it. There's no quick fixes. It's a deep engagement that's required, both with the issue and with the people that are experiencing it.
Like going back to what you talked about in terms of abnormal responses, I mean, I've heard it phrased nicely where there are no abnormal behaviors, only a normal response to an abnormal set of experiences.
Yeah.
So what that means is that you might see someone with a so-called abnormal behavior, such as violent fantasies, but if you can understand the context within
where
that person's lived, then it's actually suddenly a boy that's been bullied relentlessly, for him to fantasize about violence, and that's actually normal. And too often I find our conversation on suicide is focusing on abnormal behaviors and never the abnormal experiences that shape them. And that's where I want to try and move the conversation. Like, don't see the man who's suicidal fantasizing about violence. See what is often the boy behind that man who's experienced horrendous things that no one is ready to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, this is it. If you want to talk about male suicide, then we have to talk about almost everything under the sun. You've got to talk about childhood adversities, experience emotional neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, experience bullying, abandonment, bereavement, all kinds of traumas, domestic abuse, both as perpetuators and victims of it, family court systems, parental alienation, socioeconomic conditions, housing, everything under the sun, more or less, can potentially contribute to the pain that a person that can feel. And I think critical in all of that as well, when we think about, for example, about the tools of regulation, how culturally we can starve men of access to healthy regulation tools. This again is where the collective responsibility falls. Sometimes I feel like I'm banging the same drum over and over, but I really want people to understand and engage with the level of cultural violence that's happening to certain men because of the way that we have told them to be in the world. And George, it's unacceptable. I mean, I want people to be, it can be so deep. And I remember speaking to this older gentleman who'd made an attempt on his life. Lovely guy, George, just like could be my neighbor, you know, my friend's dad. Really seems like a sweet, lovely guy. And he says to me, in the lead up to his attempt, his thought process was, it was better for him to die than to tell his wife he was struggling.
Wow.
He thought it was better for him to die. It's better for him to die than to tell his wife that he's struggling. But that for me is this reinforcement of cultural ideas around the suppression of men's emotions, that you need to be strong, you need to be the protector, you shouldn't be burdening with other people with problems, you're not a valid recipient of care. That this build up, and there'll be other environmental things where we grew up that would also influence that. But what I mean is that can be the product, that can be the outcome of telling somebody, regulate yourself by not telling us about it, disconnect from it, suppress it. The violence that can happen to the human individual as a consequence of those kind of ideas is horrific, absolutely horrific.
Every time I talk about male suicide or learn about it, it just seems to fit less and less into the box of mental health issue and more into the box of societal issue. It seems like something that society does on two men in many different ways, rather than something that lives exclusively inside of a man's head. I don't think it's fair to chalk it up to some sort of chemical imbalance or pathology. So in many ways, I don't even know if it exists in its own right, male suicide. It's more just the consequence of so many different things when the volume is dialed up to 10. It's like it's a family court issue, or it's an employment issue, or it's a domestic violence issue, or a loneliness issue. It's not necessarily its own unique phenomenon. It's everything combined at an intolerable level. Do you think it's best described as a mental health issue, or is it more of a societal problem?
I mean, for me, it's a pain issue. Fundamentally, it's a pain issue. And I think that there are then two kind of levels to that. There are the factors that are contributing to your pain, that could be society, culture, socioeconomic, environment, childhood. All these different factors can contribute, and they all have a responsibility to bear. And at the same time, it is an individual issue in the sense that when I'm in suicidal crisis, it's in my body. The pain is in my body, and I need tools in that moment for myself to learn how to regulate and cope with it. So there is both a need as an individual. I think of it as like, in the terms of pain regulation tools, what tools am I going to use in this period of time to get me like safely through it? But then, on a wider level, when we zoom out from the pain, from my pain tank, to look at all of its different kind of potential sources, then it is everywhere. And then that's when interventions can be about, how do you learn to cope with the pain? And how can we resolve the pain? Which are different things for me. So a man that doesn't have access to his children, the only way to resolve that pain is to find a way to give him access back. In the meantime, he's got to learn to cope with that pain, which is I don't in any way mean to diminish how horrendous that pain would be. But there's kind of like two layers of operation. When we talk about interventions for the individual, I never want to lose sight of the systems that are contributing to the pain of the individual, if that makes sense. That the first study I did in 2018, I met this wonderful woman who'd lost her son to suicide. I remember her saying to me, just on this issue of like, what is mental health, mental illness versus just human emotion, human experience, human pain. I remember her saying to me, I'm not ill, but I am, if you know what I mean. I'm bordering on the side of madness, but of course I am. I've lost my child. It's not about how do you fix this, it's how do you get through, how do you cope? And for me, I've never forgotten that. For me, it was such a powerful manifestation of this impulse we have to almost pathologize human emotion. That she's not ill, but she is bordering on the side of madness because she's going through something unimaginably horrendous that cannot be fixed, but she has to learn to find a way to cope with it and to manage it. And often that's the case for people that are suicidal. If you've got a deep traumatic history of things that have happened to you, that cannot be changed. Those traumatic things have happened to you. I wish I could reach into your body and take them out and you had no memory or feeling of them, but they have happened. Often it can be about how do you learn to cope with that? How do you integrate that into your reality of things that have happened to you and be able still to access kind of the richness of a full human life? But if I may, George, I want to share with you just briefly, this year I got sent a message from a guy who was in an acute ward because he'd made a serious attempt on his life. And this is a small extract of what he said. He says real suicide prevention isn't awareness days, hashtags, or kind slogans. It's proactive support. It's patience for messy recovery. It's compassion that continues after the spotlight fades. It's professionals and communities reaching in, not waiting for the most broken people to reach out again and again. But this feeling of like, so often we talk about suicide prevention. I know it's well intended, these days that we have, these hashtags, these slogans, so much of that is well intended. And I don't mean in any way to diminish that good intention, but the reality of what some people are having to cope with runs so deep, and the path out of that is messy and it's slow and it's complicated. And I thought it was so powerful what he said. And he talked a lot in the message he sent me about the onus being on him to reach out the whole time. And he's like, I'm decimated. I'm exhausted. I'm shattered. I don't have it in me to keep reaching out. This is something that I want to kind of, in the next iteration of my work, is really start looking at how do we design services with that lived experience at its heart? What would effective intervention look like for him? In the same way, I remember somebody saying to me, basically, I'd love to go for help, but my social anxiety is so intense, I would have to extensively self-harm in order to leave the house and access help. Without having those lived experiences at the heart of intervention design, we're not going to get to real meaningful support for people.
One of the things I know you've told me many times now is we are each the antidote to each other's pain. And by that, I mean, we can all help each other by just reaching out. We don't have to wait for some sort of political reform or check to be signed by the government. The answer to suicide is within our own grasp by just reaching out and showing more compassion towards anyone, male or female. What do you mean when you say we are each the antidote to each other's pain?
I think it's like we have medicinal power. You have medicinal power, George. I have medicinal power. There's been these beautiful studies they've done where, like, scanning the brain when somebody's in pain and looking at how this sort of network changes when you're holding someone's hand and the pain lowers.
Wow.
And when you're holding the hand of someone you love, it goes even lower. That for me that's in you. That's in me. Of course, George, like I say, if somebody's tank is at 99, I absolutely wish I could just reach in and grab it and, throw it out and get it down to a 10. It's not possible. I remember speaking to a guy who was a psychotherapist, and he worked with Holocaust survivors. And he told me a story of a man who'd been in one of the camps, who shared the story of how somebody else in the camp had given him a small piece of bread, and how that gesture gave him so much energy and strength for survival, not because it in any way sated his physical hunger, but it was this gesture of humanity, of kindness, of care, of compassion that sated a different kind of hunger that he needed in that moment, that gave him, in his words, I think, the strength for surviving. I don't think we understand as a society how much we can starve men of that strength of surviving by not being compassionate witnesses to their pain.
So what is the bread of modern day then? What is the equivalent?
It's the same as it was for me 3 million years ago, 300,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago. That bread is just each other, of just care. Humans have been looking after each other. We wouldn't be here now if that wasn't deep in our evolutionary history. And now, and I look around the modern world, particularly cultures that we grew up in, this cult of individualism, this cult of selfhood that I think is so corrosive to often to meeting our needs of belonging. And I think doing this work, I'm brought back all the time into that rhythm of care. I speak all the time about community interventions, and I fucking love them, George. It keeps me going so much. People just taking care of one another. It's what we've always done,
Yeah.
I'm just on a mission to make sure that we include men deeply in that care as we do other people.
I think one of the issues I find around people not giving that care to men is often they don't recognise a man that's in distress. I mean, I'm only reading your own research back to you.
Okay.
But it's talking about, I'll just quote it. Men can communicate distress in flat and or pragmatic terms, which can be perceived as lacking in emotional urgency and so misread. Thoughts of suicide can be expressed as part of light-hearted banter or after a lot of alcohol. Scholars have suggested that societies may be more culturally attuned and receptive to female presentations of despair. What do you mean by that? Because if we're not reading men's distress, we can't even arrive at the point of offering help and support to that man. Often we are quite flat and pragmatic, especially me. Maybe we lack that emotionally heightened way of displaying distress that women have, that current sort of healthcare is centered on. So what do you mean? How do we read it?
I mean, it's interesting because I'm not somebody that when I'm very distressed, you wouldn't know it.
Yeah.
But I think that we have this kind of idea that distress manifests in very heightened ways. For some men, that's not a way in which that they would feel comfortable communicating. It's not how they're experiencing it as well, necessarily. I mentioned kind of like the next iteration of work that we want to do is about designing interventions that meet the needs of men who are suicidal. Part of that is really doing work to understand how does suicidal crisis present in men? How can we support clinicians and professionals in recognizing what those signs might look like, or how to approach those conversations in ways that are effective for men? Because we did a survey last year with health professionals to sort of start mapping the ground on this work, and I think it was only about 170 health professionals that we spoke to, George, but 94% had never had any specialized training in male suicide.
Wow, that's shocking. I mean, considering it's the biggest risk to life for men
under 50.
I found that shocking when I went to that opening for the Centre for Policy Research on Men and Boys, and Wes Streeting, who's the Secretary of Health, he stood up and opened the centre and he said something along the lines of, I recently learnt that male suicide is the biggest risk to men's life, and I was absolutely shocked. And I understand what he's getting at, but what I heard was he's the man in charge of the NHS and he didn't even know, what the biggest risk to my life was. And I'm like, that how is that acceptable that he can say that? And like I said, that's what 78% of medical professionals have no training.
94% of the survey that we did. And I feel really deeply for those professionals as well, because it's their job then to be often potentially on the front line of somebody's crisis, and they haven't been given the kind of training that they need to do that. Now, that's not in any way to deter someone from going for support if they feel that would be beneficial, but it's just to highlight one of the current gaps that we've got in the system. George, it's not acceptable.
No.
It's not acceptable. It's just not acceptable. I feel like I'm I don't understand what I'm missing.
I mean, even with the men's health strategy, which is obviously great news for those who didn't know, in England we've announced a men's health strategy that's going to start to tackle some of these issues, the first of its kind. And I read into it, and they've put in £3.6 million has been dedicated to male suicide, a lot of zeros. But if you think about how many men in the UK there are, that's 15p per man dedicated to the biggest risk to his life. So although I welcome the men's health strategy and some dedicated money going to male suicide, I mean, £3.6 million is nothing. I think that's less money than they spend on catering in House of Commons. So although I welcome it, that's not enough, is it?
No, I mean, it's again, I don't understand what I'm missing in between.
Add 3 more zeros to that.
Yeah,
that's more like it.
I mean, like you, it's a significant step forward, and I hope that we never go back to not having a men's health strategy. George, it's painful. I have to say that is painful. I think I've said to you before, I have no interest in being a trauma tourist, extracting from men their stories of suffering and pain, and then writing a paper that sits in an academic journal, and then why? It's so frustrating to be limited the whole time in the level and depth of meaningful change that can be implemented because of a lack of resources or a lack of moral courage.
I mean, £3 million is nothing. I mean, it's not that shows a lack of interest in many ways.
It's a duty of care to all of your citizens, and this is what's so hard about doing this work, George. In a way, is that we can sit here talking now, but I know that there are men right now in crisis. There are men by the time we finish recording this podcast might not be here anymore. That's the reality in which we're operating. And so it's hard sometimes to stay calm and be, I don't know, I feel like sometimes, particularly in research, it's people kind of allergic to showing that they care about something and that I care deeply about, like Georgia cares so much about things being different for not just men, but for all the people that love them and that need them. And so it's really, really, really does my fucking head in. This situation is completely, completely unacceptable. And really people need to start being more morally outraged. People in power people with power and resources and money to change this, because I don't have those things. I don't have them. The people that do need to start showing some real, like, moral courage on this.
So who are those people?
Decision makers, people with platforms. It's not okay. It's not okay that the biggest thing that's killing men in this country under 50 is so grossly underfunded, so grossly under-researched. That's completely unacceptable. We can't think that we're a civilized country when people are running surveys that are showing us 45% of men under a certain age are thinking the last 2 weeks about harming themselves and not being here anymore. That is a splinter in the soul of our societies.
Yeah. I totally agree. You always say to me in our text, like, it's hard to stay calm.
It's hard to stay calm.
I know.
And I'm really privileged to do this work, but I have contact with so many families whose sons aren't coming back, brothers aren't coming back, husbands aren't coming back. And you see the reality of the pain that they're going to carry for the rest of their lives. And and the ways that they then, so many of them are often failed as well. Not only has their loved one been failed and receiving the care that they needed, but now in terms of like trying to make change, what can we learn from what went wrong? And these institutions and systems shutting down around them. It's hard to stay calm about things. These beautiful messages that I receive from men ask me, how can I help? You know, all of this tenderness and this care. And I don't know that any of them are okay now. It is then difficult to be calm when we talk about the funding limitations, lack of research, thinking about some of the ugly comments that get expressed online or gender biases that you can experience and come up against. And that's why, you know, I keep coming back to the community interventions, because those are the spaces where I see what we talked about, this medicinal power being exercised and real kind of like beautiful things happening.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would like to echo that as well. Although there's a huge cohort of men in desperate need of help, there is also a massive group of people that are really keen to help them. It's just they just don't have the money, and they're not in positions of political power. They're people that are just running amazing little organizations or talk groups or whatever else, including yourself. That's where the real change, I think, is coming, not from Westminster, unfortunately.
And so many men up and down the country as well. Most of this stuff is led by men as well who've walked this reality, lived that experience, know this pain. You think about a man who's suicidal that may have had deep relational wounds in his past, like deep hurt from other people, and then you need to start learning to build trust and feel safe with other people. And that's what these community interventions allow the time for those bonds to be built, for you to start to establish that safety. There's so many kind of like medicinal properties to them. I do want to say in a positive way, like this year, I've had conversations with councils in Kent, Dundee, Bolton, I think it's called Holton in Liverpool, in Salford, places where they're doing proper focused research on like male suicide. I went out to Dublin to speak to the biggest energy company, ESB, out there. Workspaces are giving proper focused time and attention to this issue. So there is kind of, I don't want to sound like it's all despairing. There's some real momentum building, but at the same time, of course, we hold in mind that it's not fast enough.
No, I mean, it never will be fast enough, at least for me, like only because I'm living in the environment with these men, that I get the same messages as you, I imagine. It can never be fast enough because the problem is so huge. Last time we chatted, we talked a little bit about under-discussed groups within male suicide. I mean, male suicide is already under-discussed, but then there's groups within that are ignored entirely. Last time we talked about construction and people that are addicted to gambling, but I want to talk about a few more, and I understand you probably don't study these, so maybe you're more speculatively talking about them. But one I've learned about recently is farmers. Farmers have a really, really high rate, both mental health issues and suicide. And reading some stats now, a survey from the Farm Safety Foundation found 95% of all UK farmers under the age of 40 rank poor mental health as one of the biggest hidden problems facing farmers today. So what do you think is happening in the world of farming and agriculture that's causing such a high rate of male suicide?
I mean, those stats are really troubling, and I haven't done any specific work on that. So hypothetically thinking, if I take this framework of this core to pain, unmet needs, thinking about your self needs, you'll need to have a relatively tolerable self-view, sense of self-esteem. And I think about the potential farmer that's running a farm that's been in his family for 5 generations, and now he's facing immense kind of financial strain and feelings of like painful feelings of failure that might be coming at the thought of being the person with whom, you know, the farm is unable to continue, or thinking about unmet social needs, the needs for belonging, like how isolating farming can be.
Long hours and...
Yeah, long hours, hard work, physical work. What happens when they...
It's a bit like construction as well, where there's obviously high rates of suicide in construction.
Yeah.
Because I guess it's very similar physical job, where a lot of people, I imagine, they age out of it, where it's hard to be a farmer, I imagine, in your 50s and 60s, and yet so often they have to keep going to these ages. So I can imagine physical health, just like construction, is probably a big contributor as well.
Absolutely. And then emotional health, the stress of it all, animals getting unwell, things being quite exposed to death in that way, and potential access to means, like lots of things. When you start to think about that community of people, you can see huge potential for pain.
I know another shout out we should give to Bethan. She works a lot with Welsh farmers, and she's always banging this drum, and she talks a lot about farmers she works with, one of whom was like literally considering ending his own life because of the tax changes that are coming in, and he worked out, if I end my own life now, my family will get a significantly more money than they would after the tax changes come in.
It's horrendous. And this is also partly, I mean, Bethan is incredible. Like, she has a potential research project that she wants to develop looking at suicide of boys, which is potentially going to be absolutely stunning. I remember reading a quote, just going back to that point about the farmer. It was a study in Brazil, and the man talking about his suicide attempt said, "I tried to set up a business for my family and it failed. And therefore there was no other alternative for myself, no other alternative except killing myself." We have to, as societies, cultures, communities, start anchoring men's value beyond that domain of financial provision. You know, the brutality of that thought progression of like, I've tried to start a business for my family and it's not going to work, therefore there's no alternative. The same, I hear that echo in what you're describing about that farmer of like, I need to maximize the financial provision and support that I can provide for my family.
Well, that's what I meant earlier, and I was like, he is not having a mental health problem necessarily, he's got a financial problem.
Yeah.
And that exists external to him. Although him talking will help alleviate that pain short term, ultimately the real solution comes from legislative change. So he has that financial
It comes from legislative change. I also think it comes from a slow cultural shift of valuing men for their emotional value that they give, their relational value. I've got men in my life who, because of complicated reasons, are not in employment. They don't have that financial provision, and their emotional value to me, the relational value that they give me, there's no money that could be put on it. Absolutely no money. As culture's starting to help men understand that their value is beyond that. I completely, George, I understand that instinct that we all have to want to provide and want to protect. But it cannot become a prison of feeling like that is the only value that you have. That's heartbreaking what you're describing. Absolutely heartbreaking. And in a way, in some ways, such a beautiful gesture of love, even though you never want that person to do it. In some ways, let me say that again because I don't want it to be misunderstood. in that sentiment, what I hear being expressed is this such a deep desire to want to protect your family. And that impulse of love is so moving, but a devastation potentially for that family if you went through with it would be for the rest of their lives. And so helping that man understand that his expression of love, which is what for me is potentially underneath that thought pattern, that desire to love and protect, has other forms that it can take that are far more vital for the well-being of his family. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, he's essentially put the life and well-being of his family ahead of himself to the point where he would give up his own life if it meant they would have more financial security. But I mean, I like what you're talking about in terms of giving men more sense of meaning. I know you like a sort of visual metaphor. I see it more like a puppet where from like a various number of strings, men and women are hanging, and a man only has like 2 strings.
Right.
The idea of, financial security and job, work and money, protector, provider, whereas a woman has those 2 strings as well, but then many more. They find meaning and they have purpose towards other people for so many more reasons than just the provider. Unfortunately for men, those strings can be cut. You might lose your job, you might go into debt, and then obviously when you cut the puppet strings, that's when you have a suicidal event. But I want to talk about another group. I mean, there's just too many to get through, but you mentioned a few of the places you're working in. You mentioned Dundee, Bolton, Liverpool, obviously the north of England and Scotland. I think rates of suicide in the north of England are about twice as high as they are in London. So what do you think's happening there?
George, what I hate is I don't want to be sat here speculating. I want there to be an army of researchers. And actually, I know that Sunderland University, this is really cool, actually. I think the university, they've announced four core areas of research focus now. And one of them is male psychology. Which is fucking brilliant.
And the only
really
one of its
exciting.
kind, right? There's no other university doing that, at least in the UK.
I don't think so. I may have got that wrong, but that's really thrilling. And I think they're going to produce some really interesting and necessary work. But, you can start to speculate like the socioeconomic conditions up there, the loss of industry, exactly what you were beautifully described with the puppet strings. I have to give a shout out to the men of the Northeast because they have been the first funding that I ever got. The reason I could do my PhD was because a guy called Jeff, who lost his son Liam to suicide, paid for my PhD fees.
Wow.
Really beautiful, actually, because we did a knowledge sharing event in Newcastle this year, and Jeff could come along and kind of be in a room with NHS people from the council, the police, probation. He could be in this room and see what the research was kind of, what his support had kind of achieved. Yes, thank you.
A lot of it is down to just losing a lot of industry. There's a lot of poverty in the north and a lot of quite poor coping mechanisms. I'm sure alcohol and drugs and that sort of stuff, gambling is even more prevalent in the north. Another group, of which again, too many to name, that rarely discussed within this area are fathers. Obviously, there's a lot done in terms of postnatal depression in mothers, but never enough. But that also exists in 8 to 10% of new dads, and yet never discussed. I know we have a mutual friend who tried to talk about postnatal depression in dads. He was another suicide researcher, and he mentioned to me he was like literally laughed off stage for bringing up the idea of fathers suffering from this too. I know there's the International Classification of Diseases. The World Health Organization has this big index of every single disease or illness that you can possibly have, and each one is codified so we know what you're talking about. There is no code for postnatal depression in fathers, despite it impacting 10% of dads. But here are some of the things that have been codified, which I'm sure you won't quite believe, but they are absolutely true. We have burn due to water skis on fire. We have struck by a macaw. We have being sucked into a jet engine.
Oh my God.
We have accident whilst roller coaster riding, struck by a turtle, sibling rivalry. It's very relatable to me. Accident whilst knitting or crocheting, parachute disentanglement, walked into a lamppost, spacecraft collision. These are all real things that are codified within the ICD-11, and yet there's nothing for postnatal depression in dads. Now, what does that tell you about how we see that as an illness?
I mean, this goes back to the point I was making about the cultural change we need to make about where men derive their value from and the collective responsibility around that. The emotional, relational value of fathers, good fathers, is so critical to well-being, but we culturally can render that invisible. by not even acknowledging that there may be mental health consequences for new fathers. Like, it's everywhere. This is why I keep talking about this collective responsibility, because it is in all of these things that have to shift, that start to change mindsets. That's how the lack of visibility of that thing is what allows then to be in a room where of professionals where it gets mentioned and it's met with laughter. Like I say, the importance of good fathers, good male role models, it's unbelievable. What Sonia does with Lads Needs Dads is fucking unbelievable. I mean, that woman's a national treasure. She should be 3.6 million. This is what I mean about the medicinal power of human beings. Like, she is fueled by pain and care. And she's having enormous impact. And I think as well, there's men in my peer group that have had a relationship breakdown and they now do 50% childcare because they're single households. And I think how isolated they are, what guidance they get, where they can go to ask for help, to say that they're struggling. So I think that this fatherhood, there's so many different kind of potential dimensions to it, and again, it needs proper research, it needs proper investigation, understanding. I think I hope this doesn't sound trivializing, but I remember so vividly as a kid, we went on a school like nature walk, and I remember the teacher like showing us this log, and we were all like looking at the log, and it's just a log, not much happening. And then she lifted up the log, and there was all like this activity underneath of all these things crawling around. And I think about research like that all of the time. Like, we look at this particular issue of fatherhood, the log of fatherhood, and actually if you lift it up, there's so much going on underneath it that if you don't have proper research to really understand and explore what all of those things are, we can't really develop the like nuanced understanding and interventions that are required. So I'm really biased because I am a researcher, but I think that the research is so important.
I'll add to that the fact that those men, as we said earlier, quite matter of fact in it, displays of distress. So the log is even more difficult to understand nothing beneath that log. And the whole thing about our friend who went to do a talk about postnatal depression in dads, who is an esteemed researcher as well in male suicide, being laughed off stage. So revealing of the two parts of the problem. The first is him on stage talking about the issue itself, and then the second is an audience that laughs him off stage and doesn't want to hear any of it. The final group I want to talk about are, I'm just going by the data here. The latest ONS data on at-risk groups to suicide finds that one of them are white men and mixed race men. Another is unemployed men. Another are single men, and another one is disabled men. But the difficulty of especially white, single, unemployed men, like we're basically talking about incels, which again society seems to have only contempt for, and that again reveals the two parts of the problem, where we have a hugely at-risk group of lonely, single, unemployed white men and mixed race men, and any attempt to talk about them is often responded to with jeers and eye rolls and various other sort of insults. So how could we possibly talk about men who are single, unemployed, and particularly white, who are at particular risk to suicide, whilst sort of avoiding all of the societal stigma when talking on such a group?
Yeah, I have to say, one of the things that keeps me up at night is the issue of disabled men. I think it's 3 to 4 times higher than non-disabled men, their suicide rate. I don't know almost any research that's happening on that, and that is, again, a fucking stain on our societies. The other part of your question about white, single, lonely,
unemployed,
how can your heart not hurt thinking about what life might be like? I read a man wrote recently to me about loneliness. He said, do you want to know what real loneliness is? It's having no name to write on a form asking you for your emergency contact.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
And when I read that, George, it was like I've been punched in the stomach. I just thought, oh my God, my heart hurts so much for that man. And I thought, I wish I knew who he was, because I feel like there's so many people that would hear that would want to embrace him in community and care. But that, as a social species that's been a social species for millions and millions of years, the experience of that kind of deep level of loneliness is savage beyond description. It's absolutely heartbreaking, and it drives me fucking mad, George, because there's fucking loads of us. There's loads of us.
Yeah.
Loneliness should not be at the epidemic levels that it is in our societies. What is wrong with us? What is wrong with how we're living? It's a disgrace.
Well, loneliness isn't about being in a room full of loads of people, is it? It's about feeling seen.
That's what I mean, though. There's loads of it's about meaningful, intimate connection, and there's loads of us to be doing that with one another. But for some reason, we've created these worlds with all these kind of barriers around us doing that. And I think, and I really think of the additional ways in which men could be starved of those, of that intimacy and that tenderness and care. And it's, again, I keep making this point about the cultural violence. That is an unbelievable consequence of cultural violence. I remember this is one of the worst things that I've ever heard in this research was a man who'd lost another man to suicide, who said to me that the day he died, he texted him to say, "I love you." And he said that was the first time he'd ever expressed that to him. And in expressing that, he immediately knew something awful was happening. Now, George, that is such a brutal manifestation of that cultural violence. And it's not just on men. We all internalize these ideas. If you're told to suppress your emotions, to hide your pain, to be self-reliant, to be strong, to cope, be independent, all of that narrows the space for meaningful connection.
Yeah.
And we are a social species going back millions of years. We need each other. We don't need everybody, but we need to belong to a certain number of people. And for a human being, a human man, to live a life where he feels it's only available to him to express his love for another human being on the day that he's ending his existence, and that other person to receive what should be a beautiful expression of care and tenderness, for him to receive that and immediately think something awful is happening. George, it's unacceptable. We all have to take, I don't want people to hear that story, to hear that anguish, to hear that pain, and not pause and think,
well, it goes back to 1 in 4 men that think they can't be loved. And he's obviously one of them.
exactly. Oh my God.
So the last question I'll ask you is where we started. You talked about we are all the antidote to each other's pain. So how do we be the best antidote possible from what you've learned in your research?
I think it's so funny that my instinct is to apologize for being emotional, which is so like so at odds with what I'm trying to this happened to me once, it was probably about 2 years ago. It was the first time I've ever experienced, I was giving a talk, and I could see as I was doing this talk, there was a man in the audience who was nodding so much. Everything I was saying, he was just nodding so vigorously. And in my mind, I'm thinking, oh my God, this is resonating with him so much. And I was so moved by it. And then I went to make the next point. I just broke. And I was like, I can't speak because I'm just going to start. I'm too emotional to speak. And I sort of had to turn away. And it took me like 3 minutes or something to regain myself. And it was really helpful for me because it was like, I was like, of course I'm emotional about this work. We're literally talking about people dying from their pain. Of course that makes me emotional at times because your heart hurts for so many people, and it's frustrating to see a lack of understanding towards that pain. Going back to the sort of comments that you read to me at the beginning of the interview, George, the thing that has changed me most through this work is deep listening. Like, to really start to, I think I moved in the world with such a two-dimensional view of men before that. And I was somebody that really, like I said, I grew up with 3 brothers. I've always had very close male friends. I'm somebody that would have thought that they were deeply alongside men, but it's only through doing this work which has enabled me to do that deep listening, to really connect with the reality of men's lives, that's, I think, allowed me to show up completely differently for the men that I work with, and the men that are the loved ones in my life. And I think that was going back to the point I was making earlier about the cross-allyship and the deep listening to understand each other's experience. It's the only way that we kind of move forward out of this. And George, I benefit now from so much care from different men, and it's brought me into a different kind of like energetic balance within myself. It can be small ways, like there's this wonderful guy up north called Dan that I met early on in my research journey, and he texts me like maybe every other month just to be like, "Hi Suze, how you doing? You keeping okay? You looking after yourself?"
Yeah.
When I went to do the knowledge sharing event in Liverpool, a guy called Yinka, who runs the Hurt Locker podcast, took me for the best breakfast bagel in Liverpool. Another guy called Stephen, who runs outdoor therapy, sent me this kind of like Tai Chi meditation. Our friend Ezra sent me a book in the post that he thought I should read. Jeff, the guy whose son Liam died and he paid for my PhD, he writes a poem every year on the anniversary of Liam's death, and he wrote a poem about the research work this year. All these gestures, George, of like care and intimacy and love and support and encouragement and nourishment, which is so, it brings me into a different depth of dimension and connection with men. And I am so much richer for it, George, as a human being. So much richer for it, and I want that richness for everybody, and I hope that that richness is reciprocated by the work that I do for men as well. It's for them.
Well, it sort of shows that in the absence of full political change and structural change, the answer, as it always has been, will come from each of us as human beings for one another, like supporting one another in all the different ways you mentioned, and then obviously many more besides that. We are all still the antidote to each other's pain. And how we provide that antidote is up to you, but it could be a poem, it could be a text message, it could be donating money to a cause or PhD.
I think sometimes we have no idea how what might seem like quite small gestures of kindness can echo in somebody's life. Those examples I gave you now didn't take much time necessarily, but the way that they resonated with me is going back to that small crumb of bread. It's just a small piece of bread, but what it represents can be so kind of profound. Or I want to encourage people more to be including men as recipients of those gestures of kindness and care and tenderness. I worry so much about what tender spaces exist for men. When I went to visit Sean's place, this intervention up in Liverpool, in quite a deprived area where people are living very difficult, hard, complicated lives, I walk into the centre, George, and there's a fucking sound bath happening. It's absolutely beautiful. I can see these men lying down on pillows. It's kind of dark. There's this beautiful music happening. And I felt I could feel the tenderness. And I thought, I don't know where else in your lives you might be able to access this. We all need it so much. And I just want to stress that is that currency of tenderness and that currency of care is so alive up and down the UK. I see it from like Men Matter up in Drumchapel in Scotland, to Men's Craft down in Norwich, to Man down in Cornwall, Andy's Man Club, Talk Club. It's a heartbeat of connection, community, compassion, care. It's a place that I continually return to when I need kind of courage or resilience in this work. So grateful to all of those people that have set up those spaces, that attend those spaces. The men's sheds, just met some gorgeous people through that as well. I really encourage anybody that may get lost in the kind of bleakness of things to return to those spaces, return to the people that are trying to make change, that are using and exercising their medicinal power, and take courage and confidence from them. And I think about that often, like, you know, me sat here now, I don't feel like one individual. I feel like an army of people whose stories that I've told, of families and loved ones and of men. That unity can give courage and strength. And I think that what I'm saying is that anybody struggling, try and find those kind of like small fires of hope. Take your warmth from there.
So how do we blow a bit more air onto your small fire of hope? How do we find your work and send you these DMs and maybe even a poem of support?
Poems are very welcome, I have to say. So we are actually a big thing this year, and you know, I need to thank again Man Up, and they have supported me this year. We put an application in with the Charity Commission to set up a centre for male suicide research, which is going to be a charity purely focused not just on research, but then how do we turn evidence into action? How do we use that research to start creating real change, improving professional services, strengthening community support? So that's it. That's with the Charity Commission at the moment, and I hope that once that's established, we'll have like a flag in the sand where all those that are invested in this issue can gather. And like, you know, like I say, I would love to help a whole new kind of generation of, I want someone else to be sat George. I want to be talking to other people who can tell you about farmers, can tell you about disabled men, that we have this finance that they can access to start doing all of this research work, and then we can take their findings and start translating them into action. And I cannot just sit in an energy of like, this is what's wrong. I've got to, for my own sanity.
Well, in that sense, you sort of represent very much what I've been talking about. Whenever you sit up as a me, which has been many times now, I'm always asking you questions to which you sadly don't have the answer.
Yeah.
But you're still trying nonetheless. You're powered by nothing really but determination and grit, and of course care.
Yeah. Rage as well.
Rage.
Yeah.
Plenty of that to go around. There's so many question marks left to answer, but at the same time, there's a huge amount of goodwill that's just still trying its best. And I feel like you personify that so nicely.
Thanks, George.
So how do we find you? Where do we find your work?
My website is malesuicideresearch.com, and then Instagram, male_suicide_research are the main places to, and I really hope that there's going to be some exciting updates. It's so difficult, George, to know the right language. Like excited, you know, people are still dying. I don't mean that it's going to take an army of us to turn this ship around. And I pay massive respect to our elders in this area who've been grinding away for fucking decades in very complicated, hostile terrain. So those are the places to go. And in the words of Stevie G, my great hero, we go again.
Perfect ending. Thank you, Susie. And if anyone does want to put some money into this world's first male suicide research lab, which you mentioned, then please get in contact. Like any financial support is going to be absolutely massive.
100%. We've got big plans. I'd love to sit down, talk to people about them. 100%. We can do some, George, with resources. The number of beautiful things we could do is huge.
And on that note, I want to say thank you, and I look forward to our next discussion. Susie Bennett, thank you.